The door clicked shut, leaving nothing but the sound of his own breathing in the hallway. He stood in the center of the room, staring at the bare walls where pictures used to hang. The air felt thin, stagnant, and heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. For years, he had treated his life like a ledger, balancing every favor, every sacrifice, and every smoothed-over path. He had believed that if he gave enough, if he remained the constant, reliable fixture in her world, he would secure his place forever. Now, the vault was empty. He walked to the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had spent years building a foundation for someone who no longer occupied the space. He reached out to touch the wall, feeling the cold, smooth surface, and finally understood that the effort left him with nothing. He paced the floor, the rhythmic sound of his boots against the hardwood echoing the rigid pattern of his past life. He had treated loyalty like a currency, convinced that if he provided enough, he could purchase a permanent seat at her table. Every favor was a payment. Every compromise was a deposit. He had been so busy managing the account that he failed to notice the balance was dropping to zero. He stopped, staring at the dust motes dancing in the fading light. The truth hit with the force of a physical blow. He was not building a relationship. He was running a transaction. He had turned his presence into a service, and in the cold logic of attraction, that was a fatal error. He had sought to buy devotion with convenience, never realizing that the very act of trying to secure her loyalty was the exact thing that eroded it. By making himself a utility, he had systematically dismantled the mystery that once drew her to him. He had traded his own identity for the role of a provider, and in doing so, he had killed the desire he was so desperate to sustain. He stood still, the weight of the realization settling into his bones. He leaned against the window frame, the glass cold against his forehead, and replayed the years of being the good man. He had been the one to fix the broken appliance, the one to smooth over the conflict, the one to act as the permanent safety net. He thought he was being a partner, he was actually being a utility. He pushed away from the window, his movements sharp and deliberate. The realization burned. He had removed every ounce of space between them. By being the constant, the predictable, and the available, he had suffocated the very thing that sparked her interest. He had become a fixture in her life, as unremarkable as a chair or a table. He had mistaken comfort for attraction, failing to see that while comfort keeps a person on a sofa, it does nothing to keep them on the edge of a cliff. He had eliminated the mystery, the distance, and the necessity for her to ever reach out, because he was always already there, waiting to catch her. He looked at his hands again, realizing they had been busy building a cage of convenience, not a bridge of desire. He had been so focused on being the provider that he had forgotten to be a man with his own gravity. He walked to the mirror and looked at the man staring back, seeing not a partner, but a piece of equipment. He had become a utility, a tool, designed for maintenance, and nothing more. The shift had been subtle, a slow erosion of his own presence, until he was merely a function in her day. He thought of the times he had rushed to solve her minor inconveniences, believing he was proving his worth. Instead, he was proving his replaceability. He was the appliance that worked until it didn't, the safety net that was only noticed when the fall was imminent. The weight of this realization settled in his chest, cold and heavy. He had spent his energy ensuring he was always available, always ready, and always convenient. He had made himself so accessible that he had become invisible. There was no challenge in his presence, no friction to ignite a spark, only the dull, predictable hum of a service provider. He saw the truth clearly now. He had not been building a life with her, he had been building a system that functioned without his soul. He was a convenience, a background noise that she had grown accustomed to, and in that realization he felt the sharp sting of his own obsolescence. He began to pace the room, his stride lengthening as he forced his mind away from the trap of convenience. He searched his memory for the last time he felt a genuine, magnetic pull towards someone. It was never the person who was always available, never the one who carried his burdens like a pack mule. It was the person who had a life that existed entirely apart from his own. He remembered the way she moved through a room with a clear direction, a purpose that didn't shift just because he entered the space. She had a set of values she refused to compromise, even when it would have been easier to yield. That was the friction. That was the spark. He stopped pacing and looked at the wall, seeing the contrast clearly. She wasn't a safety net, she was a destination. Her gravity didn't come from what she did for others, but from the integrity of the path she walked alone. He had been trying to be the sofa when he should have been the cliff edge. He sat on the edge of the sofa, the fabric soft and yielding beneath him, and finally understood the paradox. Comfort is what you feel when you sink into a cushion. Attraction is what you feel when you stand on a cliff edge. He had spent years turning their dynamic into a place of permanent comfort. He had become a fixture in her environment, as predictable and stationary as the furniture in the room. He looked at the chair across from him, realizing he had occupied that same space for too long, offering nothing but reliability. Reliability, he now saw, was not the same as desire. By providing everything, he had forced the relationship into a state of stagnant safety. There was no tension, no risk, and no mystery left. He stood up, the contrast hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He had been chasing the warmth of the sofa, but he had killed the magnetism that only exists on the edge of the unknown. He was not a partner, he was a background feature. He walked to the window, watching the street below, and saw the truth of his own invisibility. He had been so reliable that he had effectively ceased to exist as a separate entity. Every favor, every smooth path, every sacrifice had been a brick in the wall of his own erasure. He had treated his presence like a utility, something to be used and then forgotten, like a light switch on the wall. He reached out and touched the cold glass, feeling the vibration of the city outside, realizing he had been waiting for a reward that would never come. Loyalty, he understood now, was not a transaction. It was not a paycheck he could earn by putting in enough hours or performing enough tasks. He had been trying to buy a seat at the table with service, but service only breeds dependency, not respect. He looked at his own hands, steady and capable, and realized they had been busy building a cage of his own making. He had been so focused on being useful that he had forgotten to be respected. The realization was sharp. He had been trying to trade his autonomy for her approval, and in the process, he had become a ghost in his own life. He paced the length of the room, his movements jagged and uncertain. Every time he spoke, he found himself checking her face for a flicker of recognition or a nod of agreement. He was a man constantly asking for permission to exist. He remembered the last dinner they shared. He had offered his opinion, then immediately pivoted to align with hers the moment her brow furrowed. He had been so desperate for her approval that he had drained the weight from his own words. He stopped pacing and stared at the wall, seeing the pattern clearly now. This constant need for her nod was a signal, a loud, broadcasted message that his value was entirely dependent on her perception of him. He was essentially begging her to define his worth. The moment he realized this, the room felt heavy. He saw the imbalance for what it was, a repulsive tether. He stood still, trying to trace the map of his own life. But the lines had blurred. Where he once had a clear trajectory, there was only a jagged shadow of her influence. He realized he had not just shared his life, he had erased it. Every personal goal, every ambition that once drove him forward, had been shelved to accommodate her schedule and her preferences. He was a man without a compass, drifting in the wake of someone else's journey. He tried to remember the last time he made a decision based solely on his own values, but the memory was buried under layers of compromise. He had collapsed his identity into hers, becoming a mirror that only reflected her needs, while his own unique path vanished into the background. This was the source of his hollow chest. He had traded his autonomy for proximity, and in the process, he had stripped away the very traits that once defined him. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass, searching for the man he used to be, but saw only a vacant space. His self-worth had not been stolen. He had discarded it piece by piece to maintain the illusion of connection. He was a man who had forgotten how to stand on his own, and the weight of that realization was absolute. The cycle had become a clockwork mechanism. He woke up, he anticipated her needs, he smoothed the edges of her day, and he waited for the spark that never came. It was a predictable, suffocating loop. He brought her coffee exactly how she liked it, placed it on the table with a silent, expectant nod, and watched her reach for it without looking up. There was no exchange, only a transaction. He was a service provider delivering a product, and she was the consumer who had stopped being surprised. He tried to force a moment of connection by planning an elaborate dinner, but as he sat across from her, the air between them felt thin and static. Every word he spoke was calculated to please, to avoid friction, to maintain the peace. But peace without tension is just stagnation. He realized then that he had turned their dynamic into a ledger of debts and credits. He was no longer a partner, he was a fixture. The world did not stop demanding his attention just because he had finally seen the truth. The noise of expectations continued to press against his temples, a constant, abrasive hum of do this and be that. He felt the familiar frantic urge to rush, to fix, to smooth over the cracks before they widened. But this time, he forced his feet to stay planted. He felt the internal pressure rising, a physical heat in his chest that screamed for him to revert to his old compliant patterns. He stood in the center of the room listening to the demands of the day, and for the first time, he did not move to satisfy them. When the phone buzzed with an urgent request, he did not reach for it. He let it vibrate against the wood, the sound sharp and demanding in the quiet air. He watched the light blink, a rhythm of chaos he had once been enslaved to. He took a breath, slow and deliberate, and felt the tension in his shoulders begin to shift from anxiety to focus. He was learning to hold his ground, not because he was angry, but because he was finally becoming solid. He was no longer a fluid shape, filling the gaps in someone else's life. He was a man finding his own center, preparing to lead with a conviction that did not require permission. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had been living as if he were a puzzle piece, searching for the one shape that would finally make him whole. But that was a lie. He looked at the stack of notes on his desk, reminders of favors to perform, errands to run, and compromises to make, and he swept them into the bin. The paper hit the bottom with a hollow, final sound. He was not waiting for her to complete him. He was not a broken fragment needing a partner to provide the missing edges. He stood up, his posture shifting, his gaze sharpening as he looked past the walls of the room. He had a path to walk, a mission that burned with its own internal heat, independent of her mood or her approval. The dynamic inverted in his mind. He was no longer a man begging for a seat at her table. He was a man building a kingdom, and he was inviting her to witness the construction. This was the shift. From the desperate, I need you to love me, to the grounded, I am building something, and I choose to share it with you. He felt the weight of her expectations slide off his shoulders, replaced by the heavy, steady gravity of his own purpose. He was no longer a service provider. He was a man in motion. The performance ended not with a shout, but with a sudden, absolute silence. He stopped the frantic adjustments, the constant scanning of her face for approval, and the reflexive reaching for tasks to solve her problems. He stood still. The air in the room felt different, stripped of the heavy, invisible strings he had been pulling for years. When she entered, the old impulse flared in his chest, a sharp, familiar itch to smooth her path, to offer a solution, to make himself useful. He felt his muscles tense, ready to spring into the role of the provider. He consciously forced his hands to remain at his sides. He did not move to greet her. He did not rush to fill the silence with chatter. He simply existed, anchored in his own skin, watching her with a clarity that had been absent for years. The shift was immediate. She paused, her gaze catching his, and for the first time, she did not look through him to the service he provided. She looked at him. The test arrived within the hour. She asked for something small, a habitual request that had been the foundation of his previous compliance. It was a simple demand for his time, a task he would have once prioritized above his own work without a second thought. The old reflex surged the urge to say yes, to be the fixer, to ensure her comfort at the expense of his own trajectory. He felt the familiar pull of the transactional loop, the siren song of good behavior. He stopped. He looked at the clock, then back at her, and felt the weight of his own standards pressing against the request. He did not apologize. He looked her directly in the eye and said no. The word hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. It was not an act of malice, it was an act of preservation. The nice guy persona shattered in that instant, leaving behind a man who was no longer a utility. He saw the flicker of surprise on her face. He had reclaimed his time, his focus, and his boundaries. The power dynamic had fundamentally inverted. He was no longer a servant, he was a man anchored in his own path. The silence following his refusal was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of a long overdue truth. He looked at the space he had carved out for himself and realized how often he had invited her to trample it. For years, he had treated his own needs as secondary, a mere footnote to her convenience. He had been a shadow in his own life, waiting for her to grant him substance. That realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He stood up, not to serve, but to occupy his own territory. He walked to the window, turning his back on the room, and felt the sudden, sharp return of emotional tension. It was the friction of two independent forces finally meeting as equals. He stopped apologizing for his existence. He stopped measuring his worth by her reaction. The fatal error was clear. He turned back to face her, not as a provider, but as a man with a distinct, unyielding center. He turned away from the lingering tension and walked toward his desk, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The urge to check if she was still watching, to gauge her reaction to his newfound distance, flared for a second, then he extinguished it. That was the old trap. He opened his notebook, focused on the mission he had neglected for the sake of her approval, and began to write. The ink hit the paper with purpose. He was no longer waiting for a signal or a nod of validation. He was building something that existed entirely outside of her orbit. When he looked up, he saw her watching him, not with the casual indifference of someone who owned his time, but with the focused attention of someone witnessing a man who had finally found his footing. He did not ask for her loyalty. He did not demand her gaze. He simply occupied his own life with such density that she had no choice but to acknowledge the gravity of it. He was anchored. He was steady. He was the architect of his own reality. And in that state of absolute integrity, he became magnetic. The final tether snapped. It was not a violent break, but a quiet, internal release of pressure. He stopped measuring the air in the room by her comfort. He stopped calculating the cost of his presence. For the first time, he was not performing for an audience of one. He stood in the center of the room, fully present, fully detached from the outcome of her approval. The shift was immediate. The stifling weight of the transaction dissolved, leaving behind a space that was no longer crowded by his desperate need to be validated. He watched her across the room. She was no longer a judge of his worth, but a witness to his existence. He breathed in, steady and deep, and felt the walls of the relationship expand. The suffocating loop had finally broken. He was not trying to hold it together. He was simply allowing it to exist. Without the constant maintenance, the connection started to breathe. He did not reach out. He did not chase the change. He simply stood his ground, anchored by the weight of his own purpose. Across the room, she moved. It was a subtle shift in posture, a softening of her gaze that had nothing to do with his previous efforts to please her. She walked toward him, not with the demands of a consumer, but with the curiosity of someone encountering a new landscape. She stopped a few feet away, observing him as if seeing him for the first time. There was no transaction here, no favors to trade, no performance to maintain. She reached out, her hand brushing his arm, a gesture born of genuine interest rather than obligation. He looked at her, his expression calm and unyielding. In that silence, he understood the truth he had spent years trying to buy. Loyalty was not a debt to be collected. It was not a reward for service. It was the only natural response from someone who finally saw the man he had become. She stayed, not because she was tethered by his efforts, but because she was drawn to his gravity. He had stopped trying to earn his place. The lesson was complete. He looked at the space he occupied and realized it was his by right, not by negotiation. He stopped seeking a seat at her table and started building his own foundation. The service provider was gone, replaced by a man with a trajectory. He turned his back on the years of performance, the frantic attempts to buy affection, and the hollow pursuit of approval. He walked toward the door, his stride measured and deliberate. He did not look back to see if she was following. He did not need to. He was no longer a variable in her equation. He was a constant in his own. He stepped out into the light, focused on the horizon ahead. He had stopped trying to earn his place in the world. He had started owning it. And in that ownership, he found the only freedom that ever mattered.